Trump in the USA from the Billy Meier contact reports.
Contact Report 821.
Well, America, that is to say the USA, will not exist forever. Because as a state, it is destroying and self-destructing from within, for which the process of dissolution of the state, although still continuing for a long time, began a long time ago. This process has been continued and kept alive, actually unconsciously, by the German descendant President Trump, so that the coming demise of America as a state will one day, in the still distant future, become reality. The USA will lose its hegemony, and thus the world power that is hoped for and aspired to in this regard, which is currently still America's endeavor, precisely to win world supremacy. However, the fact that the USA is already in the process of a creeping suicide, that is to say suicide, which has been evident for some time now through certain symptoms, is not yet recognized by anyone, because no one thinks about it, but simply lives into the day. The USA, that is to say its powerful, still think of themselves as a superpower, because many technical achievements convey a sense of security, which, however, has already begun to crumble in its foundations, which will one day bring its downfall. America underestimates the ruthlessness of its hegemonic behavior, and it also underestimates its democratic future, because within itself, there is a ruthless willingness to use violence and discontent in very many human beings of the American population. Already the ancient immigrants, mainly from Europe, created networks of hatred against the original population, the Indians, and the Wild West also took its inglorious role in killing many human beings. This, as wars also raged in America and slavery was big in trade, when in Africa, etc., the human beings of a different color were robbed and chained, shipped and brought to America, if they survived at all. For example, when a storm broke out on the high seas and the chained slaves were simply thrown overboard because the ship had to be lightened in the storm and swell. The human beings who were robbed and chained were pulled alive by the heavy chains into the deep waters of the sea and thus left to die. Among the many Europeans who kept slaves in America and made great business and profits from the work of the shackled slaves were also Swiss, such as the builder of the Linth Canal and the Shetty confectionery manufacturer. America profited from the slaves who were flayed and murdered, with the murderer secret society Ku Klux Klan in particular playing the leading role as a murderous race hater, and to some extent still playing it today. And that America's first president was a murderer who shot a peace negotiator for no reason, who wore a white flag and could not even utter a word of his noble cause of negotiating peace that was obligingly concealed and never made public. And indeed there would be more such incidents to say, but what has been said should be enough to understand that America is not what it claims to be. Well, the USA as a state will one day self-destruct and disband on its own and from within, because the USA state construct is only an illusory world that isolates itself from its own people and from the rest of the world through its internal security. America distrusts everything and everyone and denies anyone to sit at its own table who wants to bring true rights, as well as goodness, humaneness, and humanly just laws into the country. America has since time immemorial had presidents and lackeys around them, as well as in all the world, who simply carry out commands and thoughtlessly commit murders and wage wars, interfere everywhere by means of secret services and cause calamity, and consciencelessly extinguish human lives. And this is done, approved and ordered by the American state leadership, whereby hardship and misery, as well as the greatest harm, is caused, and namely also by the religious sects that exist in America and are again and again newly created, of which sometimes fathers and sect members do neither shy away from sexual abuse of daughters or other child abuse, as concerning Catholic dignitaries, nor also from enrichment through murders. However, if someone dares to speak the truth about it, then they are threatened to their life, as it happened to me when I once said something against the practices of the... America already believes that it is the ruler of the world, but this illusory empire will one day become a mirage that will shatter, because the USA will inevitably isolate itself from the rest of the world, even if this is not yet visible and recognizable to many human beings, but is already the still hidden beginning of its downfall. On top of all this, there is climate change, whereby America is unable to interpret the climatic warning signs and is also inexorably running to its doom in this respect over time. Not to mention the corona plague, which is also claiming many victims in America, as well as pompousness and criminality and actual crime and murder, etc., surpassing anything that can still be called normal. War is and remains America's profession for conquering the world. And just as it was looking for a reason to attack North Korea in 1964, it is now desperately looking for one. To intervene directly and not secretly as it has done up to now, together with its NATO in the war in Ukraine. America also wants to dominate Ukraine and adapt it to the West and is blaming all the evils in Ukraine on the Russians. Along with you, Bermuda, I have seen Ukrainian military pro forma firing into the air, running patrols and attacks that were truthfully just staged and made for news against the Russians. It was also interesting that in the war reports on TV, many buried bodies were found in a forest, allegedly massacred by the Russians. Yet Christian wooden crosses were placed on the graves throughout, which is really so unusual and strange that one has to wonder why the enemy still honors its victims on the graves with Christ crosses. What is clear is that the Americans want to dominate Ukraine and thus Russia one day, which is why everything was also done to make Putin lose patience and start the war, which has now lasted half a year and can go on for a long time due to the stupidity of the arms suppliers, which undoubtedly plays into the hands of America and the NATO murdering organization. America is deceiving not only its own people, but the whole world about the real USA intentions. All war crimes committed by the Ukrainian military are categorically, and despite evidence denied, falsified and furthermore blamed on the Russians, also self-firing and self-bombing, as we could observe ourselves together. But the truth is presented as fake by the Russophobes, and thus everything is distorted. America has more internal enemies than can be imagined, who are doing much to bring about the end of this state, even though it will be a long time before that happens. America will be hit with the full force of repressive G-Vault from within when the still clandestine opposition will one day abruptly reveal what it actually wants. Many tens of thousands will one day, as has already happened with Trump, not only take to the streets in protest, but take violent action to overthrow the government and put an end to the madness of U.S. hegemony in its own state.
Contact Report 841.
What Svath told you to do 80 Earth years ago, you really should.
Good, you are right. Then I will do what seems necessary, even if I do not like it. But I am just saying some things that seem important to me, and I am going to point by point, and I am going to start by taking up what's brewing around the world first.
1. In the peoples of the whole world. A network has been running underground for several decades, through which independence from the governments is being sought, whereby various groups with underground movements in all states of Europe are particularly involved in this. America is also particularly involved, with those groups behind Trump already appearing in public and acting against the corrupt US government. Trump is the body that is publicly championing the cause without actually knowing that he is doing so, just as elsewhere, for example in Switzerland, those elements in the government are working underground, trying to break neutrality, just as those who want to force membership of the European dictatorship, the EU. The hammer of these stupid traitors to Switzerland is that they are not even aware that they are being directed and abused by other traitorous elements to do their dirty work. Unfortunately, I do not know who these treacherous whisperers are and what their names are. Otherwise, I would not hesitate to mention their activities and their names. Unfortunately, several of the misguided people in government positions can simply be influenced, because they are uninformed, gullible people, often because they are religious believers, and therefore also worldly believers, who instead of clear and conscious thinking and understanding, only have a sham and are completely lacking in understanding. On the other hand, there are also groups in the background, especially in Europe and America, who want absolute independence and freedom without a state structure, a liberty world, a world of freedom while other groups want a world kingdom. It is already bubbling heavily underground in this regard, and the movements have already become strong, especially in America under the leadership, not recognizable to supporters, of Trump. This movement has also been active underground in Switzerland for some time, except that it has not yet officially broken out. But the same thing is also happening in Germany, where various groups are also active and have been appearing semi-publicly for some time. So these underground movements are already at work in the countries of Europe, even with stupid elements in the governments themselves, without the co-governors knowing it, and without having any idea that they are partly controlled by them. Stupid, dumb elements even sit on the highest chairs, where they do not belong and only cause mischief, which is not only detrimental to the country, but also to the people, who often only understand whistle and bang from politics and say yes and amen to everything that is chewed on from above. There is no real thinking, but everything is only based on a sham thinking, which means that everything that is not thought through is simply accepted and thus approved of, even the biggest pile of dung, when it comes to representing what others think is good. This is despite the fact that it may be exactly the opposite and consequently wrong and detrimental. The only important thing is to be able to make one's own yes on the ballot paper and to approve the opinion that others have come up with. Self-thinking is generally frowned upon, because only faith is always the order of the day, which means that the electorate never thinks about the fact that an opinion that is represented and accepted, with a yes on the ballot paper, is nothing other than a personally invented component, that is to say, an idea of a human being that he brings to bear. In any case, however, such an idea, which the human being makes into an opinion, is always only an assumption, opinion, view, way of looking at things, attitude, conviction, and thus an absolute theory, which is neither proven to be correct nor wrong. If, however, such a theory is put to the vote, then this must be done in such a process that first everything is thought through collectively, down to the last detail and the pros and cons of the effective content of the idea, that is to say, opinion, are discussed, and a clear ship is created through clear thinking and talking through before it may be put to the vote in the form of a good, according to fixed and correct, as well as generally accepted rules. This has to be done by the people themselves, or by a many-headed committee, etc., elected by the people, which does what arises and what is required with absolute integrity. But these, of whom they do not know that they are ideally controlled by them, are really the ones who want to bring very great disaster and world domination. The people themselves, who actually only allow themselves to be lulled, therefore do not know what is being played, and that there will be consequences that will bring adventurers, extremists, and degenerates who no longer want anything to do with the state. The savages will radicalize and bring the citizenry to such an extent that they will create motives from the outset that will bring dazzling communities of anarchists and freaking businessmen, esoterics of all kinds, as well as many self-proclaimed freedom fighters, stubborn people, dreamers, dropouts, and extremists of all kinds. And the nations will begin to teem with self-governors, system rejectors, and others who will turn their backs on the state. There will be a counter-society which has already formed and which will spread, just as a private resistance against the respective states will arise, because the ineffectual rulers cannot prevent the idea of those who strive for world domination, as America is doing in a different process through its desire for hegemony, that is to say, world domination. Everything has already formed underground in all states in Europe and America in such a way that it can no longer be stopped, so that the only question is when it will come to a bang, although it should not be said when that will be. That is also the case here in Switzerland, only here it is still hidden, while in America everything is already beginning to manifest itself publicly, as also in Germany, where the corresponding groups have already been brewing for decades, such as the Reichsbürgerschaft, which actually emulates the Nazi Reich, as well as others who also emulate the Nazi being. And while I am at it, it is really not to be wondered at if the human beings go berserk when already the German government, which Ptar calls a neo-Nazi government, has elements who actually undoubtedly behave and also act like Nazis. This is especially true of Zelensky, but also of Ukraine, a country that has otherwise already made a name for itself as a result of its, to say the least, strangely Nazi-connected behavior over many years. Just as America, addicted to world domination, is also being worked into the hands by granting all possible help to the warmonger Zelensky. America itself is working behind the scenes in the Ukraine war, as I have seen for myself with you. The USA and Germany are diligently helping this big-talking clown in every conceivable way, while the German Foreign Minister Baerbock is also doing everything she can to work into the hands of America and NATO, namely by bullying the leaders of various states and creating hostile sentiment against Russia, thereby evoking an evil mood of war. But that's not all. The German neo-Nazi government is also playing into the hands of the Americans by not intervening in any process against the fact that Germany has been bogged down by America since the end of the Second World War and is still occupied by the US military, and that so-called Germany is still not an independent state, but is under America's war patronage. That is to say, it is a country of occupation. This is not known to the majority of the people. It is true that the Germans have an identity card and a passport to legitimize themselves, but this is really only a pretense, because the so-called Germans are really stateless persons. Note, as can be read in the book by Daniel Prince, Wenn das die Deutschen wüssten, edition 2022. There would be a lot more to say in this regard. For example, also with regard to the various so-called state security services, then also because of France and England, Italy, Spain, and also Switzerland, then especially because of Sweden, the various former Eastern states, Russia and Finland, etc., as well as with regard to the rest of the world. Only a few names are known to me, which I also do not want to mention, although the cross-dumb Baerbock is a special case, because as foreign minister she does everything and agitates between many states with her stupid stupidity and creates even more enmity between the peoples and promotes war. Besides, too, then there is also AI, that is to say, artificial intelligence, which is getting out of hand and will take control of the humanity of the Earthlings in the future, whereby, that is to say, killer robots will do their evil work. This is because quantum technology will completely slip away from the Earthling and get out of control. Quantum technology is actually based on the fact that it can be used, for example, to explain the basic behavior of energy and matter in the atomic and subatomic range. Quantum technology is actually the basis of so-called modern physics, which is actually concerned with creation energy, but which is still erroneously called spirit. This is probably from a religious point of view, because the Earthling is a believer in religion. In the level of creation energy, that is to say the quantum level, as it can also be called, which for the time being is probably the last realization for physics, is actually the level of the original substance of matter. This level, which precedes matter, has no measurable particles for material technology, and likewise no waves, because it already reaches the area of the outer levels of creation energy, which can no longer be measured with gross material apparatus. This energy level is distributed in the entire space of creation, that is to say, in the entirety of all 7 universes, each of which has a different dimension and exists within one another. So we can speak of a quantum field that is in itself superluminously attuned to all forms of creation energy, thus permeating all 7 dimensions of the 7 universes in creation space. This field is actually egg-shaped. The creation with all its 7 dimensions, which are interwoven and independent of each other, is, roughly speaking, egg-shaped. The creation, I will explain, is a gigantic all-consciousness, which is not only single universal, but 7-fold universal and thus all-creative, once arising from the absolute absolutum, which developed via the primordial absolutum, then the creation absolutum, super absolutum, and further via the sohar absolutum, then the being absolutum, and finally found its original origin in the nihilo, the absolute nothing. See book Billy. Primordial, 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 primordial origin of all existence. Unfortunately, I cannot say much about all that is commonplace in earthly physics, because my knowledge of physical moments only relates to a general knowledge that I learned from Sfath and at school. But the truth is, nevertheless, the whole of creation has nothing to do with the limited cosmos, which alone comprises only the 4th belt of the 7-fold belts of the universe, which again is only one part of the 7-fold creation, which in itself contains 7 universes, each of which exists in a different dimension within the other. The nihilo itself is the unrevealing, the formless, unfathomable, and unspeakable, and the essence of the primal ground of all existence, from which alone everything has emerged. 3. The hammer of the future will be that the earthling will sink so low in his ethicslessness and moralitylessness that he will eliminate for life sick or physically deformed, as well as invalid human beings, on the one hand, first under the name of euthanasia and incurably ill, etc., whereby firstly in this respect seriously ill children are to be transported out of the world by euthanasia, as later also adults who are still alive. Later on, newborns with damaged bodies or consciousness, or later human beings with damaged bodies or consciousness, are to be euthanized because they will be a burden on society in the future. Europe and America in particular will be pioneers in this, with the first steps already being taken in the form of euthanasia, that is to say, assisted suicide, with regard to seriously ill children. Murders and suicides, that is to say, suicides, will become daily order, whereby everything will degenerate more and more in this respect, and the perpetrators will be younger and younger, just as the form of the human being's psychological state will become more and more negative, and he will become more incapable of living. He will again be dominated more and more by the addiction of religious and worldly beliefs, as well as by the urge for wealth, and to present oneself, and to show oneself off, and to be more than one's neighbor, etc. 4. The demonstrations concerning environmental pollution and climate destruction, etc., are increasing and becoming more and more blatant in their methods and in the destruction they cause, etc. The real evil, however, is neither recognized nor brought up, namely overpopulation, through which everything negative and destructive comes about. Through all the CO2 and methane, like all the other toxins, etc., the climate is affected and damaged, just as all the greenhouse gases, etc., are increasingly promoting the demise of the Earth, the destruction of all its ecosystems, all of nature and its fauna and flora, all the waters, the atmosphere, and the extermination of countless creatures of nature. More and more trees are being senselessly felled, and whole areas of forests destroyed for the sake of profit. Although every single tree is already important for the preservation of every living being, the climate, the atmosphere, and oxygen, as well as for the absorption of toxins from the air. In truth, it is already criminal to unnecessarily fell or cut down a tree or shrubbery, instead of planting as many trees and shrubs as is at all possible. Earth's humanity, with almost 10 billion human beings, is already about 19 times larger than the number of human beings that planet Earth can support and feed without any problems, namely 500 to a maximum of 530 million, as I have often explained over the years. This also includes the mammals, the animals, as well as the birds, fish, snakes, and the billions of other very diverse creatures, some of which have already been wiped out by the human beings of the Earth by up to 76%. But instead of the Earthlings moderating very violently with the creation of offspring and submitting to a general and really worldwide controlled birth stop that has become necessary, this is not being done. On the contrary, it is not even thought of. Consequently, instead of Earth's humanity being sensibly reduced, more and more Earth humans are unreasonably bred, as a result of which the Earth and its entire nature must inevitably collapse one day. More human beings, and therefore more births, not only mean that they require more and more energy, whereby even climate-neutral power generators, etc., produce greenhouse gases, which is usually concealed from the Earthling. Every new Earthling needs more food, clothing, more living space, roads, homes, and so on and so forth, and it needs more trees and other plants that create oxygen, water, and countless other things. But instead of the leaders of the states insisting and strictly endeavoring that a worldwide birth stop, carried out under strict control, takes effect, and that humanity is reduced in a normal process, India's project alone is of no use whatsoever. They themselves continue to produce en masse, irresponsibly, and contribute everything to the fact that overpopulation continues to rise, and continues to rise endlessly, so to speak. Demonstrations against the increase in greenhouse gases and air pollution, etc., are of no use at all if the demonstrators do not finally realize and understand that overpopulation alone must be removed. This alone made it possible for everything to get out of hand, for the greenhouse effect to arise, for pollution to become rampant, for ecosystems to be damaged and to continue to be damaged. And nature has been and continues to be harassed in every conceivable process, and many genera and species of fauna and flora have been and continue to be wiped out. And all the doings of humanity have been furthered by bloody and all-destroying wars, which, in addition to all the evil, have maltreated and continue to maltreat the atmosphere with polluting gases and poisons through all kinds of poisonous exhaust gases and bombs. But that is not all, for all the above-ground, underground, atmospheric and underwater atomic bomb tests carried out to date, totaling to my knowledge about 2050, have brought the greatest evils of natural destruction and poisoned and destroyed a great deal of the Earth's interior. As usual, America is also in the lead in terms of nuclear bomb tests with a total of 1,030, while Russia is in second place with 750, but has the most powerful with the Tsar atomic bomb. Since the American nuclear age began in July 1945, more than 2,050 nuclear weapons tests have been carried out. The last one, to my knowledge, was carried out by the crazy dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, on the 3rd of September 2017, as well as various nuclear weapons tests. The consequences in terms of health for human beings and for the environment, all the fault of America, are more than just shocking. All human beings on Earth and all living beings in general carried and still carry radioactive substances in their bodies that originate from the fallout of the nuclear weapons tests, and which, how could it be otherwise, increase the risk of cancer in human beings. A great many parts of the Earth's surface have also been radioactively contaminated at one time or another. This is because the demands and all the many desires, etc., of each of the overpopulation are the great evil, because through the needs and desires all the poisons, greenhouse gases and all the evil environmental destruction, the exploitation of the Earth and its consequences have been produced and will continue to be produced, as well as the destruction of nature, of the waters, of all the ecosystems of the planet, and the longer, the more, gradually of the atmosphere, after which all life will inevitably become extinct. It will first of all be the living beings, and they will be wiped out primarily by the human beings themselves. Then the decline will take place in that everything or almost everything will die in this respect, because the foundations of life will be minimized and destroyed to such an extent that survival will only be possible with difficulty or not at all. The phantasmagoria of space travel is also of no use here, because until it is finally so far that the Earthling can travel in space, which only begins outside the Sol system and not already outside the Earth's gravity, a great deal of time will pass if the foreigners from outside do not intervene and help the crazy Earth's humanity, or enslave and abduct them. Besides, let it be said, the nearest extrasolar system is Alpha Centauri Rigil Centaurus, and that is little more than 4.24 light-years away. The maximum speed that could be reached in space by a material object, that is to say a rocket, would be the speed of light, which means that such a rocket would need 4.25 years to reach Alpha Centauri, 1 light-year being 9.46 trillion kilometers away. But the Earthlings only have rockets that can travel just under 8 kilometers per second. Moreover, with manned rockets, they can only just reach Earth's orbit or the Moon and back, requiring about 30 million horsepower to get them off the Earth. So the Earthlings don't even reach the speed of light, and that's 299,792 kilometers per second. If the Earthlings wanted to get to the Alpha Centauri system, it would take them about 70,000 years, by today's rocket standards, but they would have to cover 1.6 billion kilometers a day. A bit long for human lives, which are currently calculated at the upper limit in Central Europe, with an average of 82 years for a man and 86 years for a woman. This, while different values apply from country to country. That is what I would like to say for the time being.
Contact Report 792.
Yes, I know. Sometimes you just get in the heat of the moment. But what has to be said is that not all Americans are behind the government and its machinations. Not even behind the shadow government, which actually fundamentally turns on everything that nobody or hardly anybody knows. Fundamentally, it is really only those of the people who want disorder, and just as much might as the powerful themselves. These are, in my view, those sad elements who also hype Trump and still do. This on the one hand, but on the other hand, also the power-hungry, who squat in the government itself, up to the top limb, who wields power wickedly as soon as they are at the top of power, and then let the power play. Basically, they are elected by the people themselves, whereby the rule is that those who are to be elected pretend to be different and just and peaceful, make big promises, and then act completely contrary to what they promised before they won the elections. The promised peace and freedom turns into war and dictatorship and everything else that is evil, except what was promised. If those elected then taste the might they now have, the evil comes up from the depths of their character, pushes outwards and spreads unrestrained. And when the rulers realize that their evil actions are working and that the people are not doing anything about it because it is forbidden and impossible for them to do so by the laws and the security personnel of the state, then the actions, switches, and actions of the rulers become stronger, more blatant, and more unstoppable. But we also have such people in Europe, especially in the leadership of the EU dictatorship, and also in Germany, where especially the brats president and foreign minister want to make a name for themselves as warmongers and show off big time. But they are too cowardly, as are the rulers of the world in general, to say something against overpopulation, to stop it from growing and to contain it, as they all in their incapacity also do nothing truthful, cause nothing, and carry out nothing to counteract the corona rampantly spreading disease so harshly that it could be shut down. With the constant ups and downs, however, nothing is being done or achieved that would curb this rampantly spreading disease on a large scale. So it will soon establish itself and get stuck as a permanent infection channel for a long time. And this will happen in the same way as the worldwide poisoning of the environment, against which those in power do nothing or not much. Consequently, for example, the waters will be poisoned more and more. And also the drinking water, which every human being, every animal and creature, as well as every other life form needs for life, and cannot live without this vital substance. But let us leave this subject because there are other things to talk about.
Contact Report 663.
Thank you. But what I want to ask now is, you told me some time ago that in the USA, the most primitive election battle ever for the US presidency was fortunately decided in such a way that the majority of the US population chose the lesser evil, thereby avoiding a world war. But I'm supposed to keep silent about that, because the walls in the center would have ears, thus carrying everything out into the world, and thus also reaching US America, which would not be good and could influence the election process in a negative way. If certain elements would come to the conclusion that the Clinton would be sawed off and Trump would take over the helm.
It would have been really dangerous if you had told something. Because in certain inner government circles and in certain secret services, there would have been very unpleasant and dangerous turmoil if they had learned of what I had entrusted to you. There would have been unparalleled election manipulations, as well as life-threatening attacks against Trump, both in the Secret Service and from the ranks of Democratic fanatics. He would not have received any help from the Republican Party, although he belongs to it, but if I want to reveal my opinion on his behavior, he has to say that he actually represents his own party, his own, so to speak, his own one-man party. As you have correctly judged him, at least as an election campaigner, he is chaotic in his campaign motives and a disaster man. I have to say, however, that he is otherwise good-minded and not bad, including with regard to Russia and Putin, with whom he honestly seeks peaceful political, military, and economic understanding. This is in contrast to Clinton, who has a sneaky and evil idea of war against Russia, and therefore firstly wants to carry out military actions in Syria against the Russian military fighting there, and also against Russia itself. A fact in relation to her thoughts of attack which she, as an enemy of Putin and Russia, has long cherished and wants to realize. And if she wins the presidential election, nuclear war would be inevitable. Luckily, that's not going to happen, as I told you on the 30th of June. Of course, the world will be shocked next Wednesday if Trump wins the election, because his way of speaking was and is not the most cultivated, but he has good approaches in various directions that he intends to realize as U.S. president. If he is not worked on by his advisors and those in between who want to direct him power-obsessed according to their scheme and certainly will in certain things, as has been the case with all U.S. presidents and will continue to be. But if he succeeds, then he will fight against globalization and against the USA interfering too much in foreign countries and thus neglecting order in its own country, but rebuilding it. But the time will show to what extent he can enforce his basic ideas, because besides him there are all those power-obsessed around him who will not let him act according to his free will, but will try to steer him according to his own discretion, as was also the case with Obama, who lacked the necessary to be able to enforce himself. And because Trump is not a real politician, but a man of business and completely disinformed in some things, he will have a difficult position in his own government as president in this respect. This will also be the case with foreign policy, in which the machinations of the EU dictatorship will also be decisive, because once he has taken over the presidency, they will endeavor to win back the close relations and connections to the White House and to the U.S. government lost to him as a result of his election through new negotiations. And as I know, the EU dictatorship will try to pull the USA on its side to form a political, economic, and military power coalition with it, whereby a coalition will be tried very early on, As soon as the first shock is over, which will hit the dictatorship which expects not Donald Trump but Hillary Clinton to win the election, which is sympathetic and congenial to the EU dictatorship.
We will now see what happens, although I have no doubt that your prediction of June was correct, and that the disaster man or the lesser evil wins the US presidency. Trump. And that would probably also be the discussion of this matter, so I will turn to something else.
Contact Report 667.
Actually, I do, and the more than 1 hour we have now spent talking has not discouraged me from asking my questions, which I still have, which I had, however, not intended to bring up with you today. But during your next visit, which I had not expected until 15th December for the correction of the contact reports, as you announced on 5th December. But since you are asking about it now, I want to ask the following. What will take place now concerning the imbecility in the USA with the recounting of the electoral votes for Trump, whereby Mrs. Is that now off the table for good?
The case is absolutely clear. Following which Trump of the right is elected as President of the USA, and that without hacking and vote rigging or miscounting of ballots, as is maliciously claimed by all the Clinton hangers-on. Trump will not be made uncertain by these dirty machinations, just as he will also select his co-workers to suit his mind. Despite all evil hostilities against him and his decrees, something that will create plenty of evil aggressions among the Republicans and also among the Democrats. And this is related to the fact that Trump is Russia-friendly and tends to have peaceful relations with Russia, which is why he will appoint as Secretary of State a man named Rex Tillerson, who is a friend of Russian President Putin, namely the head of the largest Texan, that is to say, American Energy Group, meaning Mineral Oil Group, of ExxonMobil.
This could, of course, cause a lot of trouble in the Russia-hostile U.S. America. Also, Trump and his co-workers will have a hard time implementing all of what Trump intends to do in a good way for the peace of the world and to make the USA a good America again.
That time will tell, but it will not be easy for the new president of the USA, nor for his co-workers, because various intelligence services and politicians with might will be working against Trump and by means of intrigues be striving to force him to do what they want.
This I can vividly imagine, because it was the same with Obama, who was completely turned inside out because he was too weak and too soft for the post of president. Consequently, he could be forced to do other things than what he actually promised and wanted to do. One can only hope that Trump will not let himself be cut down to size. But look here. I have a newspaper article that Achim Wolf sent, if you would be so kind to read it and then say what needs to be said about it, please.
Contact Report 668.
Thank you, that was really something to say. That would actually have been part of what I have said, but sometimes the thoughts lead in other directions, so that other aspects are not taken into account. But there is another thing we have already mentioned recently, namely the old prophecy that one day peace for the world, or at least between Russia and the Western states, will come from Russia. In this regard, we too agree that the fact that Trump was elected President of the United States, and that he also wants to establish peaceful relations with Russia and Putin, for which he also gathered important people around him, can really lead to the very first beginning of the prophecy. Have you now gained new insights in this respect, perhaps by looking ahead?
No, I have not done that yet, but I will deal with it. But what I want to say about the USA and the European Union dictatorship.
Excuse me. I must have expressed myself in a misleading way, because it is not all those things which your father's Thoth taught me, or in which he taught me. But by my question, I meant what will happen with the presidency of Donald Trump with regard to Russia and Putin.
As I have already said, I have not yet looked into this in detail and have not made any far-reaching forecasts in this regard, but only one for the immediate period up to the end of December. Seeing that the Russian President Putin will write to Trump before the 25th of December and will therefore be the first to establish contact between the two presidents.
I did not know that because Thoth sometimes did not go into specific details. Besides, as I have said before, I have buried some of your father's predictions, especially about very malicious and bad things, deep in my memory to protect myself from going crazy and going mad. But since your father's predictions, many very bad things have happened. But I could cope with them because I had hidden them within me and had not expected them at the certain times, so I did not adjust to them and only remembered everything when the events occurred. In and of itself, it has sometimes happened through some circumstances that predictions came to my mind from memory. But then I simply pushed them back again, and that until the time when the predictions became reality. Often, however, it has happened, and it still happens today, that when any conversations come up or certain situations arise, memories of your father Svath's predictions automatically emerge, which I can always cope with because I have learned not to dig around in them.
I know that, and it was and is a good thing. But if I now bring some of my father's predictions and teachings back to you, what I am going to do now to reclaim your memory, they will be facts that do not burden you so much that they would cause you problems. It makes me think that my father's predictions should be refreshed in your memory, which will certainly be good, but I still want to turn some of my thoughts to it. So let me begin by saying that it is very annoying that in the USA the majority of the population is being maliciously and hostilely manipulated against Russia by the anti-Russian influences and the other malicious, lying anti-Russian propaganda from the government and Secret Service circles, just as it is also being done in the EU dictatorship. However, this will result in a versatile and often infamous work against Trump. The anti-propaganda against him and his work with Russia and Putin in search of peace and understanding is continued, as he and his supporters are attacked and obstacles are pushed into his path and actions. This will happen from the government circles as well as from large parts of the economy, especially the arms industry, the banking industry, but especially also from various war agitators against Russia, from NATO and EU dictatorship proponents. But this also applies to all world domination addicts who see their skin swimming away, because Trump is no longer concerned with annexations and interferences in foreign states, but mainly with the construction of the USA itself, and no longer wants to interfere in foreign trade. The real reason for the aggressive attitude of the USA and its rulers, their advisors, the secret services, and the lobbyists involved, as well as the usually manipulated US presidents, on the one hand, can be traced back to Putin's sovereign course as well as Russian politics and Russia's refusal to bow to the world domination of the USA and to submit to global US rule. The USA has been concentrating on Middle East policy for decades, has instigated and waged devastating wars in Iraq, bringing chaos and disaster to this country. The Iraqi people have become religiously hostile to each other through the guilt of the United States, which was previously impossible under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. This enmity could, however, break out and become reality when the dictator was executed by the Americans. And since then there has been open enmity among the people with regard to the different faiths of their own religion, with mutual bloody and deadly assassinations. So while the USA has been trying for decades to spread world domination addiction in the Middle East, instead of ensuring order, freedom from death penalties, social security for all citizens of both sexes, sufficient work and a fair criminal law, etc., in its own country, the powerful of the country, as well as their military and secret services, continue to crave world domination. Also, U.S. America, with its completely wrong domestic and criminal law politics, neglects to lower the crime rate, as well as the open neo-Nazi system and the mercenary enterprises, etc., which prevail in the country, are not brought under control and neither stopped nor stopped. While in the USA disorder, injustice and world domination aspirations, etc., reign in the mentioned ways, Russia has restored its power and order, and the people can live in a righteous way in an acceptable social system, which cannot be said with regard to U.S. America, if everything is judged in an honest, neutral, and correct way. And it is understandable that Russia and its people do not accept the plans of the USA in Syria and Iran, as well as other states infiltrated by the USA, because they also want to finally settle down in them. But as Russia fights against the insurgents in Syria, who are supplied by the USA with all kinds of weapons, Russia has developed into a counterweight to U.S. dominance, which tends to want to destroy Russia and subjugate it to the USA. But the U.S. aspiration in this regard is also directed at the EU dictatorship and at the whole of Europe. The tensions between the U.S. and Russia, which have existed since time immemorial, caused by the aggressive stance of U.S. foreign policy, especially towards Russia, are constantly causing aggression and discord. Now, however, the new U.S. President Trump sees his primary task in his clear and positive view as preventing the old existence of U.S. one-sided aggressiveness and enmity, as well as the emergence of new aggressions and hostilities. Continued aggression and hostility would pose a threat to the order he was planning, in such a way that internal and external disorder would continue as before his assumption of office, while, as has always been the case, political confrontations, intrigues, controversies, quarrels would eventually lead to global arms movements and thus provoke further wars. The world domination-addicted machinations of U.S. America are the actually dominating reason, which leads again and again to new strategies and regional defense systems, like the power-obsessed striving for power of the USA and their interests create a hostile gap to Russia. The U.S. obsession with power has always been the reason for maintaining the delusional status that the U.S. must be a global state, which is why its foreign policy doctrine is aimed at bringing all the states on Earth under its rule. According to this fact, Russia's foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as in the Far East, creates allies and assists them in the passage of weapons, which is of course an obstacle to the USA's world greed, which also wants to get involved, as in Syria, where it supports the insurgents who fight against the irresponsible and power-obsessed dictator Bashar al-Assad, whose murderous army Russia in turn supports, because he is granted a Mediterranean shipping port by al-Assad, which should not be lost. The aggressive attitude of the USA towards Russia that has existed since time immemorial also lies in the fact that Russia pursues a sovereign political course and opposes the global rule of the USA and does not want to be subdued by the USA. So it is inevitable that there will be an alliance of Russia and China as a unique alliance model with a certain symbiotic cooperation, which of course does not please the US, which is why they try to destabilize Russia and China, for example by conceiving or launching revolutions in Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. The extremely arrogant U.S. America already decided a long time ago to lead the war banner against all states of Earth in order to subdue them. And the new U.S. president now wants to change that and redirect the world domination addiction of the USA into a world encompassing peaceful coexistence, if he succeeds in this way to really assert himself against all adversaries. But he will have a very difficult stand against all his antagonists. But if he is able to assert himself, then he will be the man at the top who will manage to turn the former wolf that bites back into a comfortably humming bear in the East and into a bringer of peace for the West and Earth, as is expressed by the old prophecy. So we can only hope that the new U.S. president will be able to assert himself with his plans and become a U.S.-American tycoon or god of fortune. A lucky charm for all earthly mankind if he is able to tame the USA as a hydra addicted to world domination. Unfortunately, however, he will have very many opponents against him who will not agree with his policy and with his actions, switching and ruling, and will try to blackmail him and to dissuade him from his plans, as has been the case in U.S. politics since time immemorial by the presidential opponents. So only good luck can be wished for him. that he remained steadfast in his plans of reconciliation in peace matters with Russia and all other states, that he does not let himself be oppressed by the adversaries and their attacks against him and become a different sense, whereby the foundation stone can then actually be laid for a worldwide peace to be built from Russia. In this sense, President Trump would then be the icing on the cake that is necessary to lead Earth and its humanity into a good, progressive, and peaceful future. And if Trump sticks to his words and promises and does not allow himself to be influenced by his adversaries, then what you wrote as a poem on Saturday, July 7th, 1949, when my father predicted to you that the USSR would be dissolved in 1991 and renamed Russia, will also be fulfilled. He also explained to you that the new German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who was elected after the World War in 1945, was the originator of a basic idea for European unification with the slogan, "Europe must be created." His idea was based on the fact that an economic interdependence of the European states must be created, which on the one hand should lead to a political agreement and on the other hand should also prevent wars. However, his ideas in this regard already emerged in the 1920s and were cultivated by him unswervingly until his death, after which they were taken up and further developed by several other well-known persons. According to my father's notes, he explained to you, in relation to this, the various paths which arose from this idea and which ultimately led to the creation of the European Union in 1993, with its headquarters in Brussels. Basically, this European Union was to become a largely peaceful union of European member states. But Father explained that over time this would result in a multi-state dictatorship that would also seek union with the USA. But this would result in dangerous hostility and agitation against Russia, which could again lead to a worldwide war if reason did not prevail. In principle, however, Russia would continue to hold back for as long as ever and would only resort to arms when hostilities, agitation, and sanctions could no longer be countered in any other way. But he also told you that Russia was striving for peace, but would ally itself with countries that were described as hostile by the USA, the European dictatorship, and the countries that were negatively and badly influenced by them. That's why my father asked you to write a poem about it, which you actually wrote. You have also mentioned that U.S. America and the European dictatorship that emerged in the 1990s will act together against the bear in the East and against Russia, respectively, which will lay the foundation for peace on Earth in later times. And since you wrote aphorisms, poems and sayings at an early age in your still young life, which my father summarized all before his farewell and left to our peoples, I know, of course, also about the poem in question. My father also encouraged you at that time to send the poem to various newspapers in Switzerland and in Germany, with an additional admonishing letter with predictions, which you then also did, but did not receive any answers, just as there were no reactions and no publications in the newspapers you wrote to. Then you were instructed not to do anything further with what you had written in this way, which you then adhered to. So everything he told you about the future of U.S. America and the European dictatorship remained a secret, as well as the fact that the bear in the East would one day lay the foundation for peace if this opportunity was not destroyed by U.S. America and the European dictatorship. If you do not have it anymore but want to, I can retrieve it so you can write it down. Unfortunately, I do not have a good memory for it because I did not memorize it.
Thank you, but I have to say that everything you have said and explained is much more than I expected. And that with the poem. I was not allowed to show it to anyone at that time. And when, as your father Svath imposed on me, I sent everything to the newspapers, but received no answer from them either with regard to the poem or to the article. I actually simply left everything to myself. Svath also said I should not let it get any more vociferous. I've never thought of that since then, because I had simply banished it from my memory when Svath said it was useless because the newspaper earthlings would laugh at everything. As a result, I no longer know exactly what I wrote as a poem and article. But if you think that it is no longer necessary today to keep silent about it, then you can recall it if you think it is important.
Contact Report 687.
Unfortunately, this will be the case again in the next few days. On the one hand, as a result of revenge by the USA against Russia, because it is assumed by the majority of the U.S. government that Russia interfered in the U.S. presidential election. On the other hand, it is also intended to prevent the U.S. president from remaining beholden to Russia, which means that he might also be deprived of the power to oppose, prevent, or suspend new embargoes and sanctions against Russia. As a result, Trump's presidential rights will also be curtailed. However, the reasons corresponding to this will be concealed and explained by lying other justifications. But it is also to be said that Trump is erratic and confusing in his actions, and consequently also in his world of thoughts. Consequently, he also wants to animate actors in order to bring them into the government and thus into his direct domain. But it is also a fact that from the bulk of all authoritative and non-authoritative persons who have a voice or only half a voice in the government and in the intelligence services in the USA, they are trying in every open or underhanded manner to drive Trump as a non-professional politician out of his presidential office, leaving no stone unturned in this respect. Of course, Trump is consistently chaotic in terms of governance, but he is genuinely of goodwill to mold America back into a great state in the world where order itself shall reign. His presidential inexperience in leading a nation, however, makes him act rashly and confusedly, which also causes many of his previous supporters to fall away from him. This also leads him, because he does not realize it out of a certain naivety, to react rashly and wrongly to whispers from his enemies and to order measures that are absurd, as is the case with his ill-advised entry ban, but as will also be the case with his ban on discriminating against transsexuals in the Army, many of whom voted for him in the election. These and other strange executive orders will earn him nasty and negative votes, as is also the case with the repeal of Obamacare, which will affect some 16 million human beings. Also, the announced wall between Mexico and the U.S., to be built as a deterrent, is in line with his perverse way of thinking and acting because...
Contact Report 707.
When I think of the USA in this regard, which in this respect practices the worst forms of warmongering, then these are once again in the foreground and in the very first place through the presidential oaf Trump. And this is because this irresponsible U.S. head of state has been grumbling for about 3 years, as has the Israeli firecracker Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that Persia or Iran must be warred against and destroyed because this country with alleged nuclear weapons is a danger to U.S. America and the world and should not have nuclear weapons, but U.S. America and Israel do. All the other nuclear powers are also likely to be involved in this, although both Trump and Netanyahu remain silent about this. So, for this reason, U.S. presidential stumblebum Trump wants to terminate the so-called nuclear deal with Iran, as already happened in Iraq as a result of blind presumption, for which, however, the effectively true reason is not the announced presumption that Persia is operating weapons-grade uranium enrichment in order to produce nuclear bombs and attack the USA. The whole thing is based on a typical U.S. underhandedness, if it really does terminate the nuclear deal. And that is that an enormous stink can be raised with Iran in order to then let the U.S. Army march into Persia by war, to be able to seize the oil deposits and to bring the country under U.S. control or even to annex it or take possession of it by force. And that the Israeli clown-in-chief, firecracker Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, will shout his pro and hooray in this regard should be absolutely clear and should cause the world to startle and howl just as much as if President Trump were to actually cancel the nuclear deal with Persia and thus get the entire world economy into trouble. This is in addition to the fact that the entire people of Iran will then also howl and no longer restrain themselves from resuming uranium enrichment and building nuclear weapons.
Contact Report 709.
I can only agree with this, and hope that your words will find their way into the ears, minds, and reason of Earthlings. But if that will really be the case, it will only be in the distant future, if the great catastrophe you have announced sweeps away the majority of Earthlings. Unfortunately, it will be the case that the majority of Earth humans will continue not to learn the effective truth of life and existence, but will continue to vegetate thoughtlessly and want to err with regard to real reality for as long as they live. Hence it will also be that the majority of human beings on Earth will continue to cheer and emulate all those erroneous and confused suggestive speeches, lies, deceptions, and false promises of the autocratic, government-unfit, irresponsible rulers. In the process, everything lying and criminal is also done to suppress and deny the real, effective reality and its truth, which could and would lead to a change for the good and the best, and into a future of effective worldwide peace, true freedom, and justice. Of course, I do not only mean the teaching of Nicodemian, the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, which is spread by the Figu Association and myself, but also any other good and correct teaching of any Earthlings who have gained their own truthful knowledge concerning life, the environment, existence, the universe, consciousness, spirit energy, mind, reason, and intelligence, as well as especially the relevant human behavior, and who spread their valuable knowledge among the human beings of the earth. And it is indeed the case that many Earthlings have since time immemorial repeatedly gained and spread good, positive, and valuable knowledge, also with regard to spiritual teachings, but as a result of the ignorance of the peoples and their oppression by the rulers of the religions and sects, as well as rulers and state powers, not much of it could really penetrate, and therefore bring about only a few positive changes. This is also true of all that is good, correct, and true, which is undoubtedly also taught in many different religions and sects, etc., although all religious sectarian posturing and posturing is excluded from real reality and its truth, in particular all the nonsense of imaginary forms, such as a god or deities, a son of God, divine prophets, divine saints, angels and devils, etc. But what I want to say about what you have said about sanctions and punitive tariffs is that I share your view about punitive tariffs. When such tariffs are levied on trade goods, as the U.S. ruler or the crazy lying presidential oaf Trump is doing against other states with regard to various trade goods, then the trade exchange economy is disadvantaged. By imbecilically levying punitive tariffs, certain trade goods are made much more expensive, just as business people and consumers are also exploited by punitive tariffs levied by government-incapable pathological imbeciles, which amounts to a sheer irresponsible act of terrorism. And the fact that the oaf Trump, whose orders, actions, deeds, speeches, and governance correspond to those of a 6-year-old boy, is of course completely indifferent, and that with his idiotic actions and deeds, he is also working against his own country. That is to say, the USA is creating enmity in various states, is something that he does not understand and, in his weakness of intelligence, is also unable to grasp, as are his advisors and all the others in his circle of government and the supporters from the people of the USA who support him. For my part, I have thought about this pompous and undignified guy, whereby I assess him in such a way that he is on the one hand megalomaniac and on the other hand domineering, as it is written in the dictionary. Furthermore, I can recognize in his whole behavior and conduct a serious defect of mind, reason, and intelligence, although I cannot ascertain whether this defect of consciousness, coupled with a certain amount of imbecility, is congenital, or whether he acquired it himself in his early childhood or adolescence as a result of his great stupidity and emotional disability. His intelligence defect, which is clearly evident to me, and his inconsistency with regard to his own statements and instructions, etc., also reveal his absurd and foolish behavior, as well as his fickleness and lying, as well as his constant changing and revoking of given instructions. and the respective thoughtless, vehement, and quick denial of negative facts which are made known about him, his behavior, actions, and deeds. In my opinion, this man is dominated by an obsession with himself, as well as by a cognitive distortion of his personality, and an overestimation of his own skills and competencies. As is unfortunately the case worldwide with many female and male government leaders of all colors, he is an element of extreme form in terms of almost boundless self-overestimation, self-congratulation, self-aggrandizement, and even self-glorification, which is particularly expressed when he signs decrees, etc., and provocatively raises them in the presence of a large group of people who admire him and demonstratively exposes them for the spectators and journalists. For me, however, a loss of reality is also recognizable. And in addition, everything is also characterized in such a way that I would like to call it hubris, a self-conceit, presumption and haughtiness, arrogance and presumptuousness. The whole of Trump's personality is also connected to a loss of reality in that he has overestimated his own abilities, achievements and competencies, as is usually the case with persons who hold positions of power, especially in government positions, but also in positions of civil servants and superiors, although these human beings, including Trump, are not aware of this fact. Such persons can also be found among all kinds of other potentates. That is to say, rulers, leaders, spokespersons, territorial leaders, regents, chiefs, headmen, commanders, holders of power, holders of authority, country leaders, bosses, commanders, and emperors. The elements falling into this round dance live under a delusion in which they believe themselves to be a very important personality, and in this way are addicted to gigantomania and megalomania. But they also live under the delusion that they must and would surpass their fellow human beings in their striving for and acting in power by exaggerated achievements, which is not usually the case because such persons turn out to be rather human rivets and zeros.
You have had good training and learnt much from my father Svath, dear friend, which is why you are well versed in psychoanalysis. Therefore, you judge and call this man's conduct mind, reason, and intelligence in a correct manner, namely that there is a certain pathological imbecility in him. That is to say, a consciousness-related disability in the form of a persistent state of clearly below-average cognitive abilities, as well as associated limitations in his affective behavior, which is predominantly determined by short, impulse-like emotional impulses and not by cognitive processes.
Thanks for your opinion, but I do not want to shine with what I have learnt of this kind with Svath, which is why I basically hold back in this regard towards the human beings of Earth, and do not bring up such things. Maybe it will be good if I just leave out what was said when I recall and transcribe the conversation and just make a few dots.
No, you should not, because your psychoanalytical assessment gets to the heart of what needs to be said about Donald Trump as an assessment.
That is also my opinion. Because this man is not only stupid and incapable as a leader, but also uneducated and absolutely unpredictable in his megalomania, self-importance, and half-baked mind and lack of reason. As I have studied the practices of the U.S. presidents and still deal with them today, I can only say that degenerations of character, lack of understanding and reason, as well as illogical, low and primitive forms, as well as underhanded hostility, strife, and war-making degenerations, such as are peculiar to Trump, were also inherent in other U.S. presidents in a different way. An undeniable fact, which often led to wars, political assassinations, government overthrows in foreign states, as well as many other serious monstrosities being triggered and carried out by the U.S. government. U.S. intelligence services and U.S. military, which also gave rise to terrorist organizations, such as Al-Qaeda and the IS or Islamist State, through the fault of U.S. policy and its machinations. And all this has been happening since time immemorial, since the United States of America has existed, because the majority of all politicians and government officials, as well as their presidents, have been power-obsessed and completely irresponsible elements since the beginning of the USA. As such, they were, and Trump is also, unrestrainedly addicted to amorality, malice and unconscionability, as well as an uncontrollable lack of restraint, indecency, irresponsibility, nefariousness, mindlessness, ruthlessness, and unscrupulousness. This also lacks any honesty, order, any sense of peace, freedom, and righteousness. However, if I take the floor now, I must now return to what Ta raised regarding a new controversy, as well as the possibility of new perfidious offensives against you, and possibly the core group members, because I am responsible for making security efforts and working out certain security measures, which we keep under control according to our directives with permitted means. We will make every effort to do what is necessary, and we will also do it in the future as long as it is necessary. Certain precautions to be carried out I will now explain to you, whereby there are also things to be done in the center compound, which are to be carried out, after which I will then check the corresponding executions in due course. However, this is not to be discussed openly, neither now nor later, and thus nothing is to be recorded by you in writing, for measures are to be observed that will be of great importance, namely with regard to the possibility. Therefore, these are to be carried out from today until 3 weeks at the latest. Namely, furthermore, the following further measures such as are also to be taken, which unfortunately it is unavoidable that, because threatening attacks must be expected again, whereby, which must be prevented. So appropriate precautions have to be taken, which give a certain security that already attempts of attack will be prevented. Therefore, period.